Hello, everybody. Welcome again to another Wagner Day stream. And this stream, we're going to be looking at the themes in the Ring Cycle. This, of course, as we've heard earlier in the day, draws upon Germanic and Norse mythology. And although it talks about tales of heroes and gods in the distant past, because it's in the distant past, it can tell us much about things that we face, about human nature and the choices that we make on a daily basis throughout the entirety of our lives. To join me for this conversation, I have two wonderful guests, so let me introduce them. First, let me introduce Dr. Alexander Jacob. Dr. Jacob has written extensively upon Indo-European mythology, and more recently, he has written a book entitled Richard Wagner on Tragedy, Christianity, and the State. 3 essays with an additional essay in the back on the Holy Grail, and a translation of Wagner's notes on his never completed opera, Jesus of Nazareth. I would thoroughly recommend this book. I loved reading it. It's very accessible, but lots of information and depth to it. And those notes on Jesus of Nazareth really blew my mind about how to interpret the Ring Cycle. So maybe some of those will feature. But yes, let me welcome. Thank you, Alexander, for joining the stream.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. And my other guest is Gifts Ungiven. She is a Wagnerite, a self-proclaimed Wagnerite, with a YouTube channel which does lots of, how would you describe it, futuristic art, which comments upon the current world. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, I would think so. I guess I'm trying to take classical forms of art or ideas and trying to refurbish them for, a more contemporary kind of setting. And yeah.
And you've also engaged a lot with Indo-European mythology as well.
Yeah, a lot. I know quite a bit. I will admit I don't know as much about Nordic mythology as I probably should, but Mesopotamian and the subject of ancient Israel, I'm very well versed in, and I still feel like in many ways those things are still reflected in Wagner's work, as you stated, with Jesus being relevant to the story. So yeah, I cover that stuff too.
But it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
And how we're going to tackle this, because the Ring Cycle, for those of you who don't know, is 4 operas. Wagner described it as 3 operas with a prologue, the prologue being a few hours long, which is longer than most people's prologue. Written over several years. So it's too big to kind of go through point by point every aspect of the plot. So what we're going to do is take a few moments, key decisive turning points, you might say, in the Ring Cycle, and then from there explore all of the themes and ideas, and in as many different paths as we want to go down. So the first one we're going to turn to is at the very start of the Ring Cycle, and we open up with this lovely chord which builds and builds in anticipation, and then on stage are the Rhine Maidens, who are these lovely nymph-like creatures living in the River Rhine. And they are frolicking around in the river, and they are the guardians of the Rhine gold, this most beautiful substance. And then out of a crevice in the ground arises this ugly, horrible-looking thing. It's this dwarf called Alberich, and he has a sudden lust in his heart. He wants to have one of the Rhine Maidens. So we have several minutes of him trying to chase them, trying to catch one of them, and then they essentially mocking him, having fun at his expense. Then the sunlight comes down onto the Rhine gold, and it lights up the river, and the Rhine Maidens are moved to joy. They start praising it exultantly. And they then say to Alberich, he says, "I'm not going to enjoy this. What good is it to me?" They explain that whoever takes it and renounces love can forge it into a ring, and this ring will give them wealth and power over the whole world. But they're not scared, because they think wrongly that Alberich won't be able to do this. All creatures live in love. Well, Alberich, perhaps from resentment, perhaps being hurt at the fact he cannot catch these Rhine maidens, he steals the Rhine gold, renounces love, and forges it into a ring of power. And so the scene is set for the rest of the cycle. So let me turn to my two guests. What do we make of this first instance in the ring cycle is a primordial fall, a fall from the state of innocence into the state of sin, we might say, or of tragedy or of brokenness. What do you make of this?
Well, I can tell you something about this concept of gold as a symbol of, glory. It actually comes from Iranian mythology. It's called Kvarena, and it's the glory that accompanies all the gods. It's like a halo, a radiance that characterizes all the greatest deities, the Ahuras. And sometimes, lesser figures, evil characters try to steal this glory from the gods, and then it reverts back to them ultimately, of course. The translation, the cognate of Kvarena in Sanskrit, which is close to Iranian, is Swarna. Swarna is gold. And this is the reason why the Germans also, who are close to the Iranians and so on, originally still have this great veneration for gold as a symbol of, glory. So that is the reason why it becomes a symbol of the Nibelung's power. It's called the Horde of the Nibelungs in the Nibelungenlied and so on and so forth. They're supposed to have had a vast collection, a treasure of gold. But that is there without much understanding of the original mythological source of this evaluation of gold. It is actually mythological. So that is about gold. In Der Ring des Nibelungen, it becomes a symbol simply of worldly power, because Albrecht seizes it, and then of course he has no mythological sense. He has only a financial sense or something, because he wants gain and power, and then that is of course the source of the tragedy. And Wotan, of course, also comes into contact with this gold and the ring because he has to pay the giants to build Valhalla, and so he has to get the gold from the Nibelungs, and then he has to produce the Superman Siegfried, who will get the ring back, and so on. That is how the tragedy evolves in Wagner.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning as well that although I said this is the primordial fall, there is a sense in which there was one prior to this within the story, but we never see it taking place. It's when Wotan goes to the World Ash Tree, to the pool, he exchanges one of his eyes for a drink for the wisdom and knowledge, and then he breaks off one of the branches of the World Ash Tree and crafts it into his spear, the symbol of his power, upon which he writes or carves the contracts which bind everything else into subordination to him, including the contract with the giants to build Valhalla, which, as you alluded to, he needs to get the ring to pay for. So this the fall of Alberich has already been paralleled or mirrored in the prehistory of even that event.
Right. I don't agree with Wagner's interpretation of Wotan. There are sort of parallel interpretations that Wagner himself adopted of his own work. He began as a sort of socialist. It was composed first in 1848, that's the time of the Revolution. And it has all those revolutionary themes where you could consider Wotan and the gods as the capitalists or something, that the new men are supposed to fight against and conquer. So you might think that Wagner is actually opposed to Wotan. In fact, Wotan is a god, and he knows everything that's going to happen. even all the troubles that he puts his children through, the Welsungen, that is Siegmund and Sieglinde and their offspring. He produces them. He knows what will happen to them. That is why when he, as a wanderer, meets Mima and Siegfried, he says, my family, whom I cherish most, that I, treated so harshly. So he knows everything. So it is not so tragic for him, and he is not evil. This incident also of the what the formation of the spear from the ash tree. Um, there's nothing negative about it, because the ash tree is the tree of life. It is a tree on which he himself undergoes a self-sacrifice in Havamal. There is a poem in the Edda called Havamal, and he hangs on the tree, just like Christ on the cross. And he says, through this, I learned the magic of the runes and so on and so forth. In fact, the runes are inscribed on his spear also. So it is not a source of tragedy that he, formed the spear from the ash tree. It is a good thing, because it reveals his knowledge of the fate of, the universe. So Wotan is not such a tragic figure because he is a god, and gods, will not die. I may also recall that at the end, in Götterdämmerung, the Norns announced that Wotan is going to burn the ash tree. In fact, he has burnt the ash tree or something as fuel with which to burn Valhalla. So all of this is part of that sacrifice that you have already in the ancient Nordic epics and poetry. So there's nothing amiss about this. This is the necessary sacrifice of the god in order to achieve knowledge. So there's not much of a negative aspect to what seems like a tragic drama, because originally it is all willed by him. So it cannot really be tragic. The tragedy, if I may proceed, is concentrated in Brünnhilde, who loses her immortality and becomes a woman, a mortal. And she's the one who suffers most because of her love for Siegfried, which is thwarted in horrible ways and so on. And then she says in the original ending of Götterdämmerung, that I, realized the vanity of this world, the illusion of this world, and I saw the world end. It's the Schopenhauerian ending that Wagner, introduced into his composition around 1856 after reading Schopenhauer. So she is the one who bears all of the tragic import of this drama, I think. Siegfried himself could be a tragic figure, but he doesn't rise to it because he's, a simpleton, sort of pure fool like Parsifal or something, and goes about, just displaying his strength and his fearlessness and so on and so forth, and then dies at the hands of more cunning people. So it's all, and he does what he does on the basis of drinking a potion or something, A tragic hero cannot be tragic if he's forced into it by these fatalistic ways. So only if he consciously does something bad, only then can he qualify as a tragic hero. So Siegfried also doesn't rise to tragedy. It's only Brünnhilde. And that is why the conclusion of Götterdämmerung is just so moving.
Gifts, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I have something to say about how I think is really a really good way to view the whole entire story, and I think Dr. Alexander actually, um, uh, laid out the story pretty well. But just another way to look at it, I think, is that from the start you have the Rheingold, and it's beautiful in its natural state, and the Rhine maidens. Some people interpret them to be seductress and this kind of awful feminine representation, and in new productions that's how they're seen, but I don't necessarily think that that's entirely the case. I think they're nude because they're very innocent, they're one with nature, and they look at the Rheingold, almost like energy or like love. It's kind of like the representation of love from God, and they're supposed to protect this Rheingold, and not by Wotan. I don't think it's actually from another god. So one thing to keep note of is that the Rhine maidens are actually above the gods in a way. That's one interpretation, because they have a god that's above them that's not Wotan. So, and that's why Wotan has to return the ring to them, or that eventually has to happen to restore order. So I might be a little bit wrong about that, but I think that that's generally what's going on. And so what happens is when Wotan, gives up his eye, ends up getting Freka, he ends up kind of renouncing love in his own way by trading his intuition, his innermost feelings, kind of more feminine aspects of his psychology. He trades that for Freka, who is a woman of convention, and so you can see that there's this switch between love and positive feminine understanding to a negative, and then you see Albrecht come onto the scene, and as you were alluding to earlier, Wagner even mentions that if it weren't for the transgressions of Wotan, that you wouldn't have the ability for Albrecht to even do the evil thing that he was going to do by taking the Rheingold. And so the last thing I'll say is that what happens as a result of this fall is that the Rheingold, which is something that is, this life energy that the natural state of the whole entire tree, where everything is taking place, it keeps order and beauty and harmony. By this renunciation of love or rejection of it, what ends up happening is that this love, this thing that's supplying energy to everything, is now going to be transformed into the inversion of what it is supposed to do for everybody. So I guess my point is that a good way to look at the cycle is there's many ways. There's several things that happen along the way, but one of the main things is that you have this substance or this thing that keeps order and keeps everybody alive, and then that's abused, and it's just the repercussion of the abuse of this thing over time. Yeah, so Albrecht is inverting that. He's kind of like, he's a dark wizard. So
Well, that's quite right, actually. Wagner had a great regard for nature, and that is why the Rhine maidens are, glorified as, good protectors of the gold. But I believe that he got it wrong, because the gold really belongs to Wotan, to the gods, and it just happens to be underground or whatever and covered by water. But anyway, it's right that Wagner, thinks that they are good guardians of the gold and should have the gold back, and that is how the story develops. So there's another thing that one could consider, and that is the Rhine maidens are rather like the flower maidens in Parsifal, are they not?
Mm-hmm.
And he resists them. Albrecht tries to get them. So, there is some of that as well to consider. Siegfried actually meets the Rhine maidens later on, and he no, he has the ring, I think, at the time, and they ask for it back, and they tell him that it's dangerous to have it because it has a curse on it and so on. And he says, I'm not afraid, because he's the fearless Siegfried. So that is quite different from, from Albrecht's behavior. Albrecht wants the gold for power. Siegfried already has the power because he's half divine or something. The Wales of, progeny of Wotan, actually.
I think.
Sorry, go
No,
ahead.
you carry on, Alexander. Carry on.
No, I just thought it's very like Parsifal also in the Garden of Klingsor. Klingsor is like Albrecht, who also renounces love. In fact, he castrates himself or something in order to get power, supreme power. And the flower maidens are part of his entourage. So, if you compare the two, it looks like the Rhine maidens are also part of Albrecht's, court, if you like.
You think so? Because I think the Rhine maidens, when Alberic goes to their realm, in the tree in this world, he's actually not of that world. He slips everywhere, he slides, he's not able to catch them. He's very much out of his element.
It's true.
So yeah, do you want to elaborate on that more? Why you think that they're connected?
They're associated simply through contact, I suppose. Albrecht is an elf. Alb is elf, actually. So he belongs to Nibelheim, that is the realm of mists, and that is in the Germanic mythology. And so he's one of the dark characters, characterized by envy and malice and all of the other evils. And throughout the story, he has control of the gold. So the Rhine maidens don't have, much of a role except to warn people of what is happening. But it's true. I mean, the Rhine maidens are not characterized as, evil in any way, simply through their association with Albrecht, as the flower maidens are through their association with Klingsor. There they are working for Klingsor.
Maybe there's an argument to be made that there's two different formations of water, maybe, Alberic being mist or related to mist, which kind of like blurs the eye. I know that that's kind of involved in the etymology of the word of nebbling, but that, the waters, the primordial waters are more flowing, more feminine, more proper orientation of water. But yeah, they do seem to have a connection between water. So I guess that would make sense that they're kind of related, maybe through passion or yeah.
I think they're also connected in terms of, if we look at Alberic and Klingsor, they both want to mislead. They want to lead others away from the true path. Klingsor himself wanted to join the Knights of the Grail, fails because he castrates himself to deal with his lustful desires. Of course, that's never going to kill them, right? And then in revenge, he starts luring knights using the flower maidens away from the Monsalvat into his domain, and so then they have to serve him. In the same way, Alberic, once he gets the ring, he first enslaves the other elves and makes them work for him and hoard gold for him. But then when Wotan and Logi go to his realm, what does he say? He says, I want to enslave the whole world, and I'm going to make more than that, though. I'm going to make the gods reject love and love gold, like me. And then I will take their women, and although I cannot love them, I will sate my lust. So there's this idea that it's not just the enslavement or like being under the power of another. He actually wants to change what they live for and destroy love itself. And I think that's very similar between Klingsor and Alberic.
Right. It's all the misuse of gold
Mm.
that is at the heart of the drama, it seems to me. Gold, as I said, is originally a glorious substance, and then it becomes an instrument of worldly power, and therein, I think, lies the, um, the plot, the tragedy.
I will say one other thing. One other element of that scene to keep in mind is that, you know, there's a almost like a coveting of the feminine, and this might actually be the relationship between Alberic and the Rhine Maidens. Is he doesn't actually love them, he appreciates what they have and their divine feminine energy, but he wants to take that energy and he wants to misuse it and covet it. And that's actually something in the West that you'll notice has happened, is that, you know, the divine feminine is not really being respected. It's kind of being used and abused in a way to, um, I don't know, you just see, it's a good commentary is what I'm saying. I think Wagner actually makes a good commentary about where society, you know, in the West had been going with concerns to the feminine. So Alberic is this perfect a showcase of how that is spiritually taking place in our world. Is that, yes, you know, you see love and you appreciate it, but you don't, you covet it. You're not actually responsible for it and loving it. So yeah,
Could I ask you just to say a little bit about what do you mean by the divine feminine? Because that won't necessarily be clear to everybody watching.
Okay, so yeah, and this is one other reason why the Rhine Maidens can be misinterpreted as being evil. They're obviously in the story. There's an element throughout the whole thing of Adam and Eve. There are apples. You know, Freya has apples. They keep the gods young. It is through the feminine in a lot of ways that love is very much preserved. And so one thing that you'll see is that there's a switch between the feminine being associated with love, then being associated with war, with the Valkyries. And that's kind of like satiating and encouraging men, just as they have an intense passion for women through love, they also have an intense passion for them. That's symbolized through the Valkyrie to go to war and to fight. So there's this, you know, constant flow between love and war. And so the divine feminine is always associated with love and war, which is really fascinating because those things seem like diametrically opposed. But I mean, it's really complicated to say exactly what the divine feminine is, but, you know, mythologically speaking, you know, Inanna, Venus in a lot of ways, like there's so many reiterations throughout mythology of the divine feminine. It's this love and war kind of dynamic. And so I guess the last thing I'll say is that the Rhine Maidens, they're, I mean, obviously associated with birth. Like there's the water, the primordial waters and stuff like that. I don't know. It's a really difficult question. I know what I know what it means for myself, and I know what it looks like, but it is kind of hard to describe. How would you, I don't know, how would you guys describe divine feminine? I feel like I'm not doing a very good job.
You mentioned Venus, and Venus is a figure that Tannhäuser repudiates also exactly as Parsifal does Kundry. So this is earthly love, lust, you know, that has to be overcome. Alberic's interest in the Rhine Maidens is only a matter of lust rather than love. You know, love is something higher and more sacred and, you know, heroic and that sort of thing. So
I think I know. It would be intuition. That would be the main. So sorry to interrupt. I just remembered. I think it would be intuition because that's the thing that Wotan loses by getting rid of his eye. And then in Brunhilde, he, and going down to Erda, he ends up, you know, replenishing his resources of intuition. So I think that my answer would actually be that the divine feminine would represent intuition, and then the divine masculine would represent logic and reason. Alexander, would you agree with that? Do you guys think that that sounds right? Because that's my understanding. Yeah.
I'm not so sure. In his prose works on drama and tragedy and so on, he says the fundamental reality at the base of the entire universe is feeling. And this is the feeling that one ought to recover in one's compositions. But this feeling, I think, is essentially a tragic feeling, as we can see from the end of Goethe. And the tragedy, of course, consists in our incarnation as fallen creatures, from the higher realm. And it is this nostalgia, this feeling of regret, of imperfection, of suffering, and so on, that informs all tragedy. And that is why in the 1856 ending, she sings as her last words in the immolation scene, I saw the world end in Zeit developed. That is the tragic feeling. And so much about the divine element. Women, he is actually not in favor of women. He's in favor of nature, perhaps, and of this, feeling underlying nature, the sadness, the sorrow of nature. But he is not in favor of women as, as superior beings. He believes that women achieve their redemption only through devotion to men, as in the earlier operas, Zenta to the Flieg of the Holländer, and Elsa to Lohengrin, a complete devotion that ends in self-sacrifice of the heroine. So it's not that women are, superior because of their intuitive powers or anything. It's just that they have a different, constitution, and can be complete only with men.
I think that's correct. So I think when we oftentimes talk about women or the divine feminine, I think lots of people tend to think that that means that one, the masculine or the feminine supersedes one or the other, and that one is more important. But I think a better way to look at it, and I think Wagner does showcase this a lot. Nathan and I were talking before, and he explained, there's always the male and the female present, not just one male protagonist or something. Though that can happen, but generally speaking, he has the masculine and the feminine represented. So I think one of the themes throughout the whole entire ring cycle is that, along with the ring and the misuse of that and technology, there's also this imbalance between the masculine and the feminine that needs to be reconciled. And so, Wotan is a representation of his era, which is of logic and reason, of logos. And what he's missing, and Freka doesn't even have this. She's like a man. She's like logical and reasonable, or not reasonable, but adheres to that. So she's like one of like marriage and law. He actually has to have a marriage with Erda to produce Brunhilde, and Brunhilde actually becomes his feminine aspect. And so that's why she ends up becoming the one who kind of saves the day in the end. And it's because she is a reflection of his feminine, something that he doesn't have. So it's what I'm trying to say is that Wotan is learning throughout this experience that what he doesn't have and what he lost with his eye was intuition, and that the West has lost intuition. And it's not that the feminine is better than the masculine. You need, logos and you need wisdom, but it's that he's trying to say that by bringing these two things in harmony, into balance, that's how creation and a proper flow of things happens. And then that's when everything is returned to a proper state like it was in the beginning before things got corrupted. So, and the last thing I will say is that Nietzsche does talk about this dynamic with Apollo and Dionysus, and that there's kind of this, because he actually wrote his book, The Birth of Tragedy, based off of Wagner's work. And he kind of, talks about this dynamic between intuition and logic and reason. And he actually insists, especially by looking at Wagner's plays or operas, that we kind of need more intuition, that we have become almost, he doesn't say too masculine, but that's where this is going. Wisdom, Sophia, these things are related. So Wagner does address the feminine in an appropriate, respectable way, and it's to bring balance between masculine and feminine, but not that one's better than the other.
I think that's true of Nietzsche. I don't think Wagner is like Nietzsche at all. Nietzsche dwells on the unconscious, which is probably, feminine or something. Wagner, not so much. And if there is anything like what you describe in Wagner, it would be in Tristan or Isolde, where the male and female are equated because they are united in death there, and there's not much transcendence of the world. There is a yearning for it, but then it is not so clear that she rises to that understanding as Brunhilde does. Brunhilde is different from Isolde, actually, greater than her, because through her suffering, she understands the whole condition of humanity and of the world, as it were. That Isolde does not do. She just is united in love with Tristan. That's all. She doesn't go beyond something quite personal, it seems to me.
I think one thing I would add though is that I think there's this scene where Brunhilde and Wotan are they are in conflict because Brunhilde's gone against his will or his conscious will, and she says, "I am doing what you really will. You may not recognize it, but I am fulfilling the purposes that you actually want in your heart of hearts." So there is this sense in which she embodies something that he's not fully aware of yet, and it only when in the third opera with Siegfried as the Wanderer has he come to terms with that reality of. Well, we'll come to the kind of themes of resignation later, but I do think that there's a hint of it there. I think it does get more fully worked out in the later operas after his more explicit reading of Schopenhauer. His reading of Schopenhauer explicitly impacts his work, but I can see a conscious unconscious aspect there.
I do too. And one thing that illustrates this is that Wotan, I really don't think knows everything. There are, even when he meets with Erda at some point, they don't really know what the future is going to hold. There are many times where Wotan doesn't know what's going to happen, and that's important because I think he's actually the one that needs to change, which is why at the end he kind of gets replaced. There's a new order, and that's kind of like his consciousness kind of realizing itself by letting go, by not trying to control the outcomes of everything, and letting Brunhilde, take the lead on her own, free will. And that's why this bit about freedom is so important. That's when realization and change can happen. So I think that's a good point, Nathan.
Before we, sorry, Alexander, please come in,
No.
Alexander.
Well, I mean, his earlier conception of the conflict is a revolutionary one, and he associates Wotan with the realm of laws and so on, legal contracts and that sort of thing, which he's completely opposed to as a Proudhonian. He is more of a freedom fighter, a fighter for freedom, individual human freedom, and that sort of thing. So in that respect, Wotan must die. In fact, he doesn't. In fact, all of this is willed by Wotan. And the one who rises to understanding is Brünnhilde. First, she is an immortal, a Valkyrie, and then she becomes a woman. And through her womanly, human suffering, she achieves understanding, enlightenment, and that is her progress, I think.
I think it's definitely her progress too. Yeah.
I think so there was a quotation I wanted to bring in here before we move on to maybe the next kind of major event is and this comes from Wagner's notes on Jesus of Nazareth, but I think it's very applicable, many of the quotations, because it captures something of what you were mentioning, Alexander, the Proudhon anarchist socialist ideals that he had when he originally started the project. And it goes. So he writes the following. Let me get the right page. It is the same case with the law of property. In it, love, insofar as it expresses itself in man as the pressure towards satisfaction through the enjoyment of nature, and he capitalizes nature, and its products, solidified into an exclusive right of the individual to nature, even beyond its enjoyment in itself. Through this right I ward off the enjoyment by another of that which I myself have already sated myself, and thereby seek my satisfaction, not in enjoyment itself, but in possession. And I see this very much in the opening of the Ring Cycle, because you have this stark contrast of the Rhine maidens who do not seek to use the Rhine gold in any particular way, but praise it. They are stunned by its glory and want to share that with other creatures. They invite Alberic to join into their celebration. And whereas Alberic, all he thinks is, how can I use this thing? He's got a very functional view. How does it benefit me? And he then takes it and prevents anybody else from enjoying that right. Indeed, it then becomes him trying to accumulate all things under himself. And you could see it on the flip side with Wotan and the original kind of questions of trading Freya for Valhalla. Of course, that he says, I never really meant that. He then gets the chance with the ring to keep it for himself, but he eventually, after some struggle, gives the ring in exchange for Freya. He gives the ring for Valhalla. So you can see that there is this kind of idea at the this quotation captures a key idea for Wagner's, at least Das Rheingold, in terms of, do you take or do you give? Do you love or do you dominate?
Right. And of course, the renunciation of love is a condition for the acquisition of power. That's clear in Parsifal, it's clear also in the Ring. So that is about giving and holding on to something.
I think that's
selfish means.
And it's important to note, because a lot's made of the shift in Wagner's values once he read Schopenhauer, but this seems to be a theme which, although it might change a bit, is maintained throughout. That he has this
Indeed.
fundamental conviction of the power of love over
Right.
and the attitude which comes with it.
Right. He wrote that sketch for Jesus von Nazareth in 1848. It's the same year that he started composing the Ring, so it's not surprising. Schopenhauer just deepened his understanding of these matters. So his focus on love is constant. It informs all of his operas, actually, and it's about selfishness and selflessness. The divesting of the ego, which is quite important. in all of his tragedies, in all of his writings also.
Well, let us turn then to the kind of second aspect, because we've already kind of got started with it. And it is the explicit kind of introduction of love in a very powerful way in Die Valkyrie, the second opera. We have our two main characters regarding this are Siegmund and Sieglinde. Siegmund is on the run. He finds a house and takes rest there. And he sees this lovely, beautiful woman, Sieglinde, and they fall in love. But Sieglinde is married to a man called Hunding, who we discover had captured her during a raid and taken her as his property or as his wife. As the story unfolds, it turns out that Siegmund and Sieglinde are actually brothers and sisters. But that does not stop their love. In many ways, it kind of intensifies. So, and then at the same time, we discover that Hunding's family and Siegmund are in conflict, and so they're going to have a duel. Now, he believes that he will win because he is able to draw a sword which has been blessed by Wotan, that whoever wields it will have victory in battle. But among the gods, Fricka is nagging Wotan, essentially, to say, look, this incestuous relationship cannot stand. It goes against your laws. He must die. And so he sends Brunhilde with, in a remorseful way. He doesn't want to do this, but he sends Brunhilde to essentially take Siegmund to end his life, or to warn him that his life will end, but offer him the chance of Valhalla. He asks, will Sieglinde be able to come with me? And she says no. To which Siegmund says, well, I do not want to come then. I would rather go to Helheim. I would rather go to the worst place possible than go to this Valhalla with its cold delights. And she is so struck by this love that transcends any other gift, any other reward, that she's willing to actually resist Wotan's will and attempt to save Siegmund in that duel. So we see this very powerful concept of love being worked out here. And, you were talking about the masculine and the feminine gifts earlier on. Is there any significance with it being an incestuous relationship, a brother and sister? With this,
I think the reason why that's in the story is, though it might seem gross, I mean, these are they're ways to illustrate how basically what's happening to the characters, and it's almost like karma. Like there's an original event of a fall, which happens with the payment of the building with the giants, and they get, all of that stuff. And then by the time you keep going along the path of the ring, all of these curses befall people. And everyone needs to learn through this cycle in order for Wotan to produce, an heir to be able to defeat the dragon, to get the ring, to defeat Alberic and save the world. He needs to make sure that this union, or not this union, but that he's able to bring to fruition a sufficient warrior to make that happen. And so he's hoping that it's going to be Sigmund, but because of this incestuous union, and there is adultery because she's married, what happens is that, Fricka's like, hey, no, this is not acceptable. But Fricka doesn't really understand love, right? She's not a woman of intuition. She's very much about law, about marriage and convention. And what's happening here is that Wotan is actually trying to break free of his laws. Because he needs to make sure that through all of these transactions with his original, bad contract with the people in the previous scene that's led to this whole mess, he needs to make sure that, this cycle can be broken. And so what I'm trying to say is that, he thinks he's actually really smart, and he's manufacturing this situation where he's going to get what he wants, and Sigmund is actually going to go defeat the dragon, and it's all going to work out because he's like master planned everything, tendy chess. But that doesn't work out because they end up coming together, and this is, again, it's the curse doing its thing. And so this, what it shows is that possibly in the past, these things that have happened haven't really been reconciled and understood. So it's going to be the next generation who hopefully learns from mistakes, and Wotan's mission can be complete, but not through him. So the fact that they are going outside of the laws of marriage, so the incest is actually showing that. And Wotan even says this to Fricka. She says, you need to kill Sigmund. And he says, yeah, but didn't Sigmund actually learn love, and their union, they came together, and it was actually something that happened that goes beyond convention and law? And she's like, I don't care. So the reason for the incest is to illustrate that these characters, in order to fulfill what they're supposed to do in like this karmic cycle, is that they need to break the laws of convention and move past that in order for things to progress and to inspire Brunhilde. Does that make sense? Because I'm pretty sure that that's what's going on. At least that I think.
Well, in all mythologies, there's one god who creates a man and a woman, and in all those mythologies, the first man and the first woman would be brother and sister, like Adam and Eve.
Yeah, and that's related too. There's definitely an Adam and Eve and a sinful kind of nature thing going on. Hence the idea with karma. But yeah, I think it's just convention being broken down, because that's like the main thing, is that these characters need to experience true freedom. Sigmund can't just be, as Fricka says, he's just your pawn in your game. So you're not actually letting things happen as they should. So it's this incest that breaks like tradition, basically.
I think that's right, and I would add as well. There's again from Jesus of Nazareth, the notes. He comments upon the nature of marriage. So these comments, I guess, are criticizing a social institution rather than making necessarily a deeper point. But we can draw a deeper point, and I think you've already done that. He writes the following regarding marriage: the striving of the woman for freedom through love thus became a sin. She could attain the real satisfaction of her love only through adulteries, if her marriage was not founded on love in the first place.
Yeah.
And I think that's illustrated both with the adultery, because Hunding literally takes her as his own property earlier in, before the story begins. And then the incest heightens that point in terms of the conventions are preventing love from taking place or from being fulfilled, or love is in conflict with the social order. But then, as you've alluded to, it's also these more foundational laws are at stake, or the plans are in terms of getting back the ring, the power, also come into conflict with that love.
Yeah, and just to illustrate further, it's Wagner himself and Nietzsche wrote about this too. They want to go back to nature. The more natural something is, the better they kind of think that it is. And so Wotan, in order to, through his scheming, trying to like kind of get out of the mess and the confines that he has as a god, because Alberic isn't confined by those things. That's actually the conflict, is that, Wotan has to be lawful and good, and Alberic, can just do whatever he wants, because he's renounced love. He's going against nature completely and entirely. So it's weird, but yeah, this Wotan needs to break from convention, but he does that through his children. So he has, his children are wolf related, and actually Hunding and his people are dog related. That's actually something that's made clear, but it's this fight between like being domesticated versus being like wild. And so that's like a part of it. To become free, you need to become wild. So yeah, Nietzsche and Wagner both emphasize like a return back to nature and like an abolishment of laws in a certain way. So it makes sense within the context of the story.
I guess as well, there's and this is not something we didn't really comment on, but Wotan's power with Valhalla. He sees Valhalla as securing his strength. And how is this paid for? Well, with the ring, but he has to steal the ring itself to achieve this. So there is this tension that actually the moral law or Wotan's laws are based upon an act which would violate his own law. And he comes to kind of comment on this later on, that to Brunhilde, that it was by an act of theft, and this was, there's a tension there at the very basis of the social order, I guess.
Yeah, well said. I agree with that.
Is there anything you want to bring in here, Alexander?
About what? Siegmund and Sieglinde? It's another tragic episode. But what I remark most is Sieglinde's lament at the end of this, and she actually sings the same melody that Brunhilde also sings at the end of Götterdauer. And that after Brunhilde reminds Sieglinde that she mustn't sorrow so much because she's going to bear Siegfried, and that is the hope of the future, and so on. So what is interesting is that is the first introduction of that melody, which concludes the whole opera. It's called the grosse melody, the great melody, the great tune, if you like, which concludes the last opera and is first sung by Sieglinde, actually. So it's a premonition of the entire tragedy of Siegfried that is to follow. She is consoled by Brunhilde because Siegfried will ultimately, hopefully, get the ring back, but he doesn't. And so Brunhilde, just has to lament in her turn at the end of the opera.
I think that's a really fantastic point. And to tie it in with something you said earlier about the nature of, for Wagner, how women find kind of redemption through, you mentioned earlier, sacrificing in love for their male lover. But there's also another thing that he writes in Jesus of Nazareth, which is tied in with that. And I'll just read it very, very quickly, because I think it really taps into Sieglinde. The essence of woman is, like that of children, egoism, sorry, gifts. The woman gives nothing, but receives or returns what she has received. Just as the child, until its maturity, is imperfect in itself and can demonstrate some activity only in the reciprocation of the love of the parents, the woman is imperfect in herself and can attain activity only in the reciprocation of the love of the man. In her rise to the man, whose love she receives, she finds the only possibility of shedding of her egoism into the universal, namely in the children and in her giving to her children. The bearing of children and her giving to them, however, is always only a return of that which was received. And I think that's really important, because when she discovers that Siegmund has been slain, she wants to die. She doesn't want to go on. But it's when, as you say, Alexander, when Brunhilde consoles her with the promise that you are bearing his son, that she goes on. She manages to keep going until she is given birth to Siegfried. So you can see this idea of Wagner's very clearly in that character, and that this is an idea that he continually returns to within the commentary, is that there's a sense in which when we pass on to the next generation, when we give up to the next generation, whether it's through death or childbearing or so on, when we pass on what we have to them, that is an act of love that all of us can achieve.
Right. Love. Actually, if you consider love in all its scope, in its fullest scope, then it's the same as renunciation, because you have to renounce your ego, and then you have to renounce the whole world that grew out of egoism. So the whole of tragedy is just a revelation of the nature of the world. And love is only the means of recognizing it.
Well, I think that might be a good point just to move on to our third aspect, perhaps, because it ties in very well with that, and then we can kind of delve into it, which is that we've already alluded to it several times. It is the very end of the cycle as a whole. I'll try and fill in very briefly what happens in the two operas prior, but basically Siegfried is born of Sieglinde. He is this mighty, fearless hero who manages to reclaim the ring from Fafnir the dragon. But he is seemingly at this point unaffected by it because he has no desire for power. He is, as Alexander said, a kind of pure fool. But he seeks out that which will make him afraid, and he climbs up the mountain. He overturns Wotan's spear. He breaks it, climbs up, and finds Brunhilde enshrouded in a ring of flames, and he's able to pass through, being the fearless hero. They fall in love, and it seems like there's going to be this great reign of love. People have said, it's kind of, you can interpret it Feuerbachian in terms of the gods have been overthrown and the reign of love will take place. But in Götterdämmerung, this all comes crashing down in very serious ways. Siegfried, through the machinations of Alberich's son Hagen, he is tricked into betraying his love for Brunhilde. He does things which break their bond of trust unwittingly. She then kind of demands for retribution and justice, and Hagen, in pretty much in cold blood, kills Siegfried. But then at the end, that she has the ring now. He gave the ring to her freely as a token of his love. She then decides, well, as we see the funeral pyre, she will be immolated with Siegfried. And at the same time, this will lead to the immolation of Valhalla, the flames rising up to there, and the ring will be returned to the Rhine maidens. Hagen and all of the evil associated with him are washed away into the Rhine, and we return to the original state, as it were. So this is a very powerful kind of ending of the whole world going up in flames. What do you both make of it? What are some of the symbolism and ideas going on here?
Well, I mean, if I can venture first, there is something about the sleep of Brunhilde as well, is there not? Because he wills that she, an immortal, become mortal, and that is his punishment for her, because she has supported Siegmund in that quarrel. And so when you consider the course of the story, it is as if he wills that the humans must take over. It's a kind of renunciation, willing that humanity will find a way upwards. In fact, it doesn't, because Siegfried falls, but we only have the hope at the end of it. So that is about the sleep scene of the Zauberfeuer scene. And then at the end, also you have an immolation. But this is rather peculiar. Fire purifies. In Iran and India, we worship fire. because it's a purifying element. And so, you could consider that as having purified the ring or something. Though I don't say that Valhalla needs to be purified at all, because it is the dwelling of the gods. Um, it ends ambiguously, with flames engulfing Valhalla also, but it doesn't stand to reason that it must be destroyed. It is a heavenly, edifice. So the tragedy, or the irony, if you like, lies in the fact that at the end of the opera, everybody is dead, or no longer standing, except Albrecht. All the others die. Hagen is an Eblung, that is the Ghibellines. He's a man. He is the son of Kriemhild or something, and Albrecht. But Albrecht is this black elf, and he survives. He's the only one that's left standing.
I actually didn't know that. I don't know how I missed that. But yeah, he did survive.
Yeah, and there's no mention of his dying, so he's there.
Yeah, you're right. Uh-oh, that's not good.
Yeah.
Well, it implies, I guess, because the Rhine Maidens are also there at the end, so there is an implication that the cycle's going to start again.
That's right. Okay, there. Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, that makes sense.
4 operas. Like Hollywood has its sequels.
There you go.
Star Wars too.
Yeah. So there's from the previous opera, you have this kind of reconciliation between masculine and feminine, and they're trying to produce an heir that can complete this duty of Wotan, so that the world doesn't get destroyed. And in this process, there's kind of like a transmutation that happens, and Wagner's really good at doing this. But you see how the feminine and the masculine become one through Siegfried gaining freedom. He fights the dragon, which kind of represents Kundalini energy. He advances himself. He can understand birds, and the birds lead him to his prize. And that's usually the case, is that women, there's always a dragon before you get the gold, and and the woman, that's actually like how you upgrade in life and become more advanced. So Siegfried is representative of I guess you could say the concept of the Superman. Like, I think that's where Nietzsche got that idea from. And what he is he's, there's an interesting point when he goes to visit Brunhilde. There's the fire, which Lodge or Loge, who basically is representative of the devil. It's kind of weird. It's a complicated thing. But fire is also good, like Alexander mentioned. There's this moment where he has to, it's almost like he's looking at his past self. Because, when he goes to get Brunhilde, he has to first face Wotan. And what's fascinating is that Wotan's spear, which has etched into it, all of the laws of their realm, of, the whole universe, that originally broke Sigmund's sword, which becomes Siegfried's sword, which he had to reforge in order to fight the dragon, and then to fight someone who is a reflection almost of his past self. So he has to fight Wotan, and in doing so, he breaks Wotan's spear. Kind of in this moment, there's kind of like a breaking of the old order that happens. And freedom and independence is continuing. And Siegfried is kind of representative of the Christ, because he's kind of, beyond, he's not beyond good and evil, but he's able to move past the laws that are already established. But yeah, after he fights Wotan, he ends up, there's a further transformation. So he has to fight almost like somebody who's his former self. But then he also meets Brunhilde, who he originally mistakens, for his mother. or a man. So there's two conflations of like himself. Is this my mother who I am trying to connect with, and my feminine that I don't understand, and then also the fact that she looks like a man initially before he removes her armor. He's suddenly struck that this is a woman, and then this is what causes him to feel fear for the first time, and this is where love really starts to enhance, and we start to learn more about the concept of love and how powerful it is. So my last statement here is that it's a transformative moment for Siegfried and Brunhilde, because Siegfried is basically learning who he is through his other half, and this union they're the union who's supposed to save the world together. So through the masculine and the feminine coming together, you learn about love and how to save the world, basically.
You mentioned Kundalini, which is a great analogy, because the serpent, a dragon, is called Nidhogg. Need is a word meaning envy and malice, and it surrounds the world, actually, in all mythologies, in Sumer, Egypt, and India, and Germany also. So this is the serpent that has to be attacked first and actually killed. And out of its body is created our universe. So that is the deed of Siegfried. He doesn't know it, of course, because the mythology is only in the background of the story. So there is nothing very redeeming about the serpent. In Kundalini Yoga, which is a form of yoga in India, this serpent is at the base of the spine in the human body, the human microcosm. And it is disciplined in such a way that it will rise to the uppermost chakra and unite with Shiva. That is somewhat different. In all the mythologies, the serpent is completely killed and destroyed. So much about that dragon that you mentioned.
Sorry. Gifts, you seem like you wanted to come in there.
I was just going to say that it kind of seems like what Wagner's trying to allude to, because Siegfried puts his hand in his mouth and he actually ingests the blood of the dragon. And what happens is, like I said before, he can actually understand the birds. And birds are kind of like, they're like the most apex, not apex predator, it's not the right word, but they're a snake and a bird come together. So they're kind of like the ultimate animal in a way. So I think there's kind of, an evolution being alluded to, that by killing the dragon, ingesting the blood, he's advanced himself. So
yeah. I mean, you can definitely see he was influenced by the Hegelian school of philosophy. And what's the kind of basis of all reality in Hegel? It's thesis. Something rises up against it, antithesis. But then through that conflict, they come together, synthesis. And then a new cycle begins. And I mean, that's an example of it. We were talking earlier about how the cycle kind of comes back to its original point, but maybe there's been development along the way. So now it's a synthesis and the whole cycle can begin again. So there definitely is that kind of thing going on there. And maybe tangentially related, I think there's maybe some connection here, is you mentioned that when Siegfried sees Brunhilde, he feels fear for the first time. But this is then also provides the opportunity for love between the two. And a number of writers have, including Hegel, Jean-Paul Sartre would be another, have spoken about the recognition of the other as the other, that they're not just another extension of our will or something that's significance is defined by our desires and wishes, but actually have their own independence, integrity, and freedom. When we see that, and then we can recognize, oh, we look like something to them. We are something to them. We become conscious of ourselves as objects too. And so I wonder if there's almost in this moment Siegfried, who up until this point as Alexander has been saying, is this kind of simpleton who really a child essentially.
Yeah.
He acts he does what he wants to do. He has no compunction of kind of other interests or the interest of others. He fights the dragon because he wants to find fear. That's what he wants to do. He wants to find something that will scare him. It's not about defending a village or something like that, right? So there is this sense that through that encounter with something which is truly other than himself, the woman who has never encountered a woman before,
Yep.
that helps him to see, oh, there's things in this world other than me. There's an other perspective that I should acknowledge and adhere to, or relate to as one perspective to another. And I almost wonder, and I was just going to say, this is of course fully worked out in Parsifal as a key theme, but I think we're seeing a bit of it here.
Well, I was just going to add that I think another element to add to what you're saying is he's even more vulnerable than that, because in realizing that there is a woman there, and like you said, he doesn't even know what a woman is. He's never experienced that. He's feeling feelings he's never felt before. There is kind of a suggestion that through intimacy with a lover, that's when you're most vulnerable. And it's actually the most terrifying thing, because you're relinquishing yourself to that person completely and entirely. And it's in that moment where, in the past, people would say if you had intercourse with somebody, you would know them better than anyone else. And so I think one of the things that's so terrifying to him, and again, like you guys said, he's very innocent, to realize that he can be seen so fully and entirely. It's like his armament has been removed, and now he can feel fear because he realizes that he can be seen fully and entirely. I think that actually might be a part of it.
Well, he has reason to fear, because ultimately it's Brunhilde who plans his death.
I mean,
yeah, because once she realizes that she's been duped, by all this magic, and that instead of Gunther, to whom she is betrothed, Siegfried comes to sleep with her.
I don't think that's the meaning. I don't think I disagree with this.
She makes Hagen kill him. She reveals to him that he's vulnerable at the back, and so Hagen stabs him in the back.
I don't think that that's what this is. I have to disagree. I think that this is a beautiful moment when the two come together, and I don't think that it's fear out of. I think it's fear out of being seen, being exposed, being vulnerable with somebody, and that's why this love really intensifies. That's why they so deeply, madly fall in love with each other, because it's completely and entirely genuine. So I don't think it's. I'd have to disagree. I don't think that the events that come later. I don't think he has some sort of premonition that she's like Eve and evil or something like that.
No, he doesn't have any premonition of anything. He doesn't have much understanding, actually, of the events around him. And he's not a very highly developed character, as Brunhilde, as I said, is finally. So what he experiences in love, we don't know. It's probably what any young person would. It's certainly not expressed in any philosophical verse or anything in his singing.
But I think it's the key. It's one of the key things that allows them both to kind of become the heroes at the end and be as selfless as possible. And so there really has to be an understanding of true love between them. And so in order for him to truly become the hero, he has to know, what being vulnerable is, and that's what fear is. So, I don't think it's denoted by that, but we can agree to disagree.
Well, I think there's a nice middle line between the two. I'm going to try and bring a synthesis to this thesis and antithesis here, in that I think you mentioned that if you're vulnerable, that you're open, you're exposed to somebody who, if they do not give of themselves in return, if they just take, that destroys you in the process. And I think even if he wasn't aware that, of the events that are going to take place, the events that do take place show how precarious such a love is. That it is not something
That's true.
which um, it's not something which is a given, and so when it goes awry, it does destroy you. I think that's well, it destroys both parties essentially, and it has a terrible effect on their relationship, and then all of the other people who are involved in that plot. Nobody is left in a good place from this situation. So
Well said.
I think I think you can draw that line of, yes, it is this beautiful moment, but the very beauty of it is also the danger of it.
Yeah, well said. I think that's perfect.
So I guess one question would be then, as we're getting towards the end, I think there's 2 points that I want to kind of hit on before we finish. One is, why then does it all fall apart? What's the significance of it not going on into a kind of reign of love, and instead Siegfried being duped in the way that he is? Why do you think Wagner wanted to have that as the next part of the story, beyond kind of the inspiration from the source material? What's the thematic significance?
Well, it is the source material, I think, that
Okay.
dictates the plot. And as for the conclusion, I mean, there's only the slight glimmer of hope that, future humanity may be able to redeem what was not redeemed by Siegfried, and that's all. But otherwise, it is all rather bleak, I think, at the end. There's nobody left to carry on the fight, as well. But anyway, it's extremely beautiful because of its music. He wrote this poem, the operas, the libretti first, in 4 years or something, and then he started composing. and it's just amazing. First, that he composed the opera as prose or verse, and then set it all to music, and such extraordinary music, of
Mm.
such extraordinary beauty. So, I mean, it required a genius like him. So, when you consider the opera as a whole, it stands because of its, you know, overwhelming, powerful effects in music, and that is all due to him. It does not have very much to do with philosophy. It is his intuition of all the feelings that underlie
Mm.
human emotions and action. Only a genius like Wagner had that, and we cannot but just admire it and wonder at it because we do not have it. It's that musical genius. So,
Oh,
yeah, the philosophical significance. Well, it's again love and power, right? Albrecht renouncing love for power, and all the others renouncing power for love, or at least Brünnhilde in particular.
mhm.
Yeah, so Brunhilde's the one that ends up learning, you know, how to. She learns the message of everything that's happened, with the ring.
Mm.
And so the whole cycle is about, um, again, kind of like it's almost like karma. And so the gods get involved in the human affairs and all these affairs in order to make certain outcomes happen. And Wotan, she actually criticizes Wotan, and she says, you flew away. You didn't actually do the things that you were supposed to do, and you were actually a huge part of the problem. And so, in a lot of ways, through Brunhilde, they're able to bring about, um, kind of the redemption. She takes Siegfried, and they enter into the fire, and she returns the ring. But it's through her realizing, all of these things that we've been doing, all of these debts that we've paid, through this curse. We need to realize those things, is what she says. And instead of like Wotan, which is kind of Wotan's kind of representative of like the government. That's one thing that I saw mentioned. You could kind of look at him that way. He's the institution. He's the one in charge, and he completely and entirely, wants to evade, like his past transgressions. Whereas, Brunhilde, being his other half, being his feminine side, is able to intuit things that he can't. She's become free, and through this process of becoming free, she gains an understanding of love. And then by the end, she's the one who kind of ends up, in a way, being the hero. Well, she is, because she's the one who successfully, because she's, Wotan's other half, intuition instead of logic, she's able to understand that love is the key thing. And she's able to, separate herself from the situation and say, I'm going to do this for everybody. This world is going to be doomed if we don't get rid of this ring, if we don't properly bring an end to things. And so I guess, my point here is that, that, Wotan kind of wanted to run away from these things, and Brunhilde ends up,
Mhm.
being the one who learns that, it's love that matters, and intuition and stuff like that. So, I don't know that it entirely ends on a bad note necessarily, because, that's kind of, Wagner believed that the cycle is actually, and change is actually a good thing. And as a last note here, the reason why that's the case is, Wotan is constantly resisting change, or constantly resisting his downfall as God. But Brunhilde is like, no, we need to learn from our past mistakes and change.
Oh no, no, there I have to disagree. Wotan actually wills his own end. That is in the ancient mythology. It is also in Wagner. So he's the one who burns that tree. It's the tree of life. It's the universe. in order to serve as fuel for the destruction of Valhalla. So it's all willed by him. So the gods, are on a higher level altogether. So it's very difficult to draw them down to the same level of tragedy as the humans. So there's only Siegfried and Brünnhilde, and I think Brünnhilde wins as the tragic heroine.
No. That's definitely wrong, because Wotan is the one that ends up beginning the problem through his exchange for power through giving up his eye in the primordial water. And then this enhances the intensity of the ring. That's why the ring and the eye are associated to each other. But what ends up happening is Wotan is constantly trying to keep his position, and he has to keep relinquishing, his power, and that needs to happen. And actually, Wagner even says himself about the opera that Wotan is a dying god, that he's actually a man of his former, era, and that it's Siegfried who's supposed to be the one that is, the eclipse of him. And so the important thing here is that really the whole story is about Wotan realizing himself through his children. Because there's this one point when he's, again, Fricka's like, hey, you're manipulating things. You need to let things happen as they should, or else Alberic is going to control the world. He realizes that anybody, Sigmund is just a copy of him, and he realizes through Brünnhilde in a lot of ways that through intuition, through letting go, that he's going to actually advance himself through death. And that's actually the lesson that is kind of passed on through Brünnhilde, is that Brünnhilde, they all have to die. There has to be a selflessness in order for this change and this renewal to happen, this renewal of the gods. So,
but the quarrel is not so much between the gods and the humans. It is between the god and the elf, the black elf who has forged this destructive ring. And the mortals are only the means of recovering that ring for higher purposes.
Yes, but clearly, Wotan, through his children, through there's a death of him. That's actually something that needs to happen in order for the world to replenish and change and get better.
It's just a transformation. It's like God the Father, God the Son, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
See, I think that there's truth in, again, I'm not, I promise that I'm not just doing this. I think there's a point of synthesis here.
Okay.
Because
we need Hegel all the time.
I'm sorry, but I think I think Gifts that you're right that Wotan does go on a journey from a degree of we see that he is tempted by the ring in Das Rheingold, but he gives it up. And as the story goes on, he reaches a point where before he despaired of the end of the gods, now he accepts it, and he does so joyfully. He tells Erda this, before Siegfried comes to break his spear, or it might be after. I can't remember the order, but that's, he says that. But Brünnhilde is Wotan's true will. And so I don't think that we should see them as inherently in conflict. Rather, there is a point of conflict where, because Wotan's trapped by his own law, and then also he cannot necessarily see, but he comes to a point where he realizes, actually, she is the extension of my true will, and my will is for this to take place, for this, end of this current order, or end of this current cycle. So yes. I see that the two, it is Wotan who wills it, and you could look at various psychological analyses as a kind of model of that, as the ego, but also it is Brünnhilde who is the one who carries forth his will. So I think you're both right on this. I don't see a competition here.
And just one thing to add to it, I do think it's important to note that I do think there is something, because the Rhine Maidens, they are, they have a father that they're protecting the gold for, and that's not Wotan. And it's important to understand that these gods, which are kind of representative of an Aryan race, the people who were kind of at that time controlling the world or whatever. That's kind of what it's representative of. They aren't. Wotan is not God, but he is representative of the Father. So him going through a transformation is something that I'm just suggesting is definitely key here. And yes, and I agree that Brunhilde, it does make sense what you said. I think that that's very well said, that she's clearly his other half. And in wanting, you know, uh, Siegfried to be that person, it kind of ends up being Brunhilde, which is very beautiful because it's literally his other half. And that's very transformative. I think that's incredibly beautiful. So yeah, well said. I agree.
So we're come towards the end. Everything must come to the end. I guess that's one of the lessons of the ring cycle. But by way of closing, is there anything that either of you would like to discuss or comment on? Alexander, I'll start with you.
No, not particularly. I think we've discussed a lot of points.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I did my recordings of Wagner, it was only because I was so fascinated by the music. I did not study it for philosophy or anything. It's only now that I've begun to investigate its philosophical aspects, because Wagner was philosophical in his temperament and manner. So I think the music itself is so powerful that it requires more hearing and understanding in its own right, apart from the philosophy. So.
I think that's beautifully put, and I would encourage everybody who's watched this to go and watch the Ring Cycle, or get a recording, or because it isn't a work of a philosophical text. It is a work of art that needs to be encountered and experienced, even just for the ideas we've been talking about to have their full import, to feel the truth rather than just think it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally agree, Alexander. I think that's that can be the danger with a YouTube stream on the analysis of the ideas. I agree. And I should say as well, I didn't say at the beginning, but you very kindly said that we can include excerpts of your playing throughout the stream. So I'm very grateful to you for that, because I think that will help the audience to hear what we've been talking about as well.
I hope so. Yes. Well, I'm glad you wanted to do this. So
definitely. Gifts, do you have any final comments or thoughts?
Yeah, I think Alexander's leaving it on a good note, which is no pun intended. Is sorry. That I think what's most important about this is to realize that Wagner has created, as you guys said, it's a piece of artwork. And what does that mean? It means that it's not just about the philosophy. It's not just about the social commentary. It's about many things. Like there's generational things happening. There's philosophy. There's mystical, spiritual things. But the most important thing is the way that he makes you feel those things through the music. And the music is, to further this idea of almost like an alchemical reaction in you. He definitely got that tradition from Beethoven, and that was something that was cropping up during his time. And it was using music in that way, and it had never been used in that way before. So I guess to encourage other people to try to experience this, it really is a full, all-encompassing piece of art that I don't think people are aware of how incredible it really is. It is a stunning, beautiful piece of art, because it really does move you And it's not just the philosophy and stuff like that. It is the music actually brings these things to light, you know, and amplifies all these things. That's what's so incredible about it.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. And I have nothing more to add, which is rare for me. So thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Gifts. I think this has been a really great discussion. I think we've got to some of the core issues within the operas, and then also some of the differences of interpretation as well that the opera brings forth. And I think that's provided a really rich discussion. So thank you once again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
thank
much.
you. Well, everybody, we will be finishing this video now, but don't fear, there are many more hours of Wagner Day to go. So stay tuned, there'll be something up next. The schedule's yet to be fixed, but it will be fixed by the time you see this. So till then, cheerio, everyone.